In February 2026, one of the world's largest car companies walked into a press conference and announced a number so staggering that analysts physically gasped in the room: 22.2 billion euros wiped out in a single year. That's more than the entire GDP of Iceland. It's the biggest write-down in the history of the Detroit auto industry, bigger than anything GM posted during its 2009 bankruptcy. And it happened to a company that just 4 years earlier had been pitched to investors as the future of the automobile. The company is Stellantis. You probably know their cars without knowing their name: Jeep, Ram, Dodge, Chrysler, Fiat, Peugeot, Alfa Romeo, Citroën, Maserati, 14 iconic brands under one roof, and all of them right now are somewhere between struggling and bleeding out. 7 straight years of declining United States sales, a CEO who called the collapse a small operational error and then resigned, factories running at barely half capacity, and a $26 billion bet on electric vehicles that analysts now call the single biggest capital allocation mistake in automotive history. This is the story of how a merger that was supposed to save 2 dying auto empires created the biggest car crash of the decade instead. To understand how Stellantis lost 22 billion euros, you have to understand what it was supposed to become. In January 2021, 2 struggling auto giants made a bet that shocked the industry. Fiat Chrysler, the company behind Jeep, Ram, Dodge, and Chrysler, had spent years bleeding market share in North America. Their cars were outdated, their factories were underfunded, and their CEO, Sergio Marchionne, had died in 2018, leaving the company without its visionary. Across the Atlantic, the PSA Group, Peugeot, Citroën, and Opel had the same problem in reverse: strong in Europe, virtually non-existent in North America, and terrified of a future where Tesla and Chinese manufacturers were gaining ground fast. Their solution was a $50 billion merger. They called it Stellantis, from the Latin word stello, meaning to brighten with stars. 14 brands, 400,000 employees, operations in 30 countries. On paper, the 4th largest automaker in the world. The pitch was simple: share platforms, share engines, share factories, cut costs, and suddenly you would have the scale to compete with anyone. Carlos Tavares, the PSA CEO who took the top job, was famous for one thing: cost cutting. He had turned around Opel after PSA bought it from GM. He had made Peugeot profitable again. The board gave him 5 billion euros in promised annual synergies and essentially said, "Do your thing." And for the first 2 years, it looked brilliant. Stellantis posted record profits in 2022. Tavares became the highest paid auto CEO in history, 36.5 million euros. The stock traded above $20. Every analyst report used the same word: lean. But what nobody said out loud was that Tavares was cutting into muscle, not fat. And by the time anyone noticed, the patient was already bleeding internally. The first crack appeared in the one market Stellantis could not afford to lose: North America. Jeep, Ram, and Dodge were the moneymakers, 55% of total revenue, almost 70% of profits. These weren't just brands, they were the entire reason Fiat Chrysler was worth buying. The Wrangler, the Grand Cherokee, the Ram 1500. These were American icons with profit margins that German luxury brands envied. So what did Tavares do? He raised prices aggressively. A Jeep Wrangler that cost $31,000 in 2018 hit $40,000 by 2024. The Grand Cherokee climbed past $60,000 fully loaded. Ram trucks crossed $70,000. At exactly the moment American consumers were getting squeezed by inflation and rising interest rates, Stellantis was telling them to pay premium prices for vehicles whose underlying engineering hadn't fundamentally changed in years. The result was catastrophic. By mid-2024, Jeep sales had dropped 36% compared to pre-pandemic levels. Dealer lots overflowed with unsold inventory. At one point, 70% of Grand Cherokees sat unsold on lots. 7 consecutive years of US sales decline. 7. That's not a bad quarter. That's a structural collapse. And Tavares' response? In an earnings call, he called the entire North American crisis a small operational error. A small operational error. a 36% sales collapse at your most profitable brand, dealers publicly begging the company to lower prices, inventory rotting on lots across America, and the CEO calls it small. The board didn't fire him that day. But looking back, that was the moment his credibility died. And then came the electric vehicles. In 2023, Stellantis announced one of the most ambitious electric vehicle plans in the industry, 30 billion euros through 2025, 4 dedicated electric vehicle platforms, a battery gigafactory in Indiana, an entire Ram 1500 electric truck. By 2030, they promised 100% of European sales and 50% of US sales would be electric. The problem wasn't the ambition. The problem was that almost everything they predicted about the electric vehicle market turned out to be wrong. Demand for electric vehicles in the US did not explode the way they forecast. It grew, but not nearly fast enough to justify 30 billion euros. Traditional truck buyers, the core Ram 1500 customer, did not want electric. They wanted the HEMI V8, the same customers Stellantis had been quietly phasing out. By early 2026, the reckoning arrived. Stellantis announced it was canceling the Ram 1500 battery electric vehicle entirely. It was hastily bringing back the HEMI V8 for the 2026 model year, the engine it had spent billions trying to replace. It sold its 49% stake in a Canadian battery joint venture, and it wrote down 22.2 billion euros, essentially admitting that a third of its entire electric vehicle investment had been vaporized. One analyst called it, and I'm quoting here, the single biggest capital allocation mistake in automotive history. Not an exaggeration. A 22 billion euro bet that the customer would follow where regulation led, and the customer said no. Carlos Tavares resigned in December 2024. It wasn't officially a firing, these things never are. But after a 64% drop in earnings, a collapsing US market, and dealers in open revolt, the board had seen enough. What his successor, Antonio Filosa, inherited was worse than anyone had publicly admitted. North American factories were running at 52% capacity, half the assembly lines were idle, revenue had dropped 27% in a single year. The stock had fallen 45% from its peak. North American sales fell another 25% in the second quarter of 2025 alone. Then came the full year numbers for 2025. Net loss 20.1 billion euros in the second half alone, the first annual loss since the merger that created the company. And that number included the 22.2 billion euros in write-downs, the admission that Stellantis had spent the early 2020s building a product nobody wanted at prices nobody could afford. The 14 brand portfolio, once pitched as a strength, had become a millstone. Chrysler had been reduced to a single model. Dodge was a shell of its former muscle car identity. Alfa Romeo, Lancia, DS, these brands existed almost entirely on European balance sheets, burning cash on marketing while contributing almost nothing to the bottom line. Stellantis wasn't too big to fail, it was too big to manage. So where does Stellantis go from here? Because here's the uncomfortable truth that makes this story different from most corporate collapse narratives. They might actually survive. The first quarter of 2026 showed a small profit. Jeep posted its first sales increase in years. Ram trucks gained 23% in the fourth quarter. The new CEO is slashing the bloated brand portfolio, cutting prices where it hurts, and doing the one thing Tavares never did, listening to dealers. But the structural problems haven't gone away. The company wrote off 22 billion euros, but it didn't fix the underlying issue. Stellantis still has too many brands, selling too many overlapping vehicles at prices that customers increasingly reject. The competition, Ford, General Motors, Toyota, and a wave of Chinese manufacturers are not waiting for them to figure it out. And crucially, the electric vehicle problem hasn't been solved, it's been paused. The Ram 1500 battery electric vehicle was canceled, but the regulatory pressure to electrify isn't going anywhere. Stellantis kicked the can down the road. Someone will have to pick it up. What happens next depends entirely on whether Filosa can do what Tavares never could, shrink the company strategically instead of just cutting costs until things break. because in the car business, you don't die from one bad year. You die from 7 years of pretending the problem is small. Stellantis just admitted the problem is 22 billion euros large. That's a start. The Stellantis story matters because it's not really about cars. It's about what happens when a company confuses scale with strength. The merger that created Stellantis was sold as a masterstroke, consolidation, synergy, efficiency, but stacking 14 struggling brands on top of each other doesn't create one strong company. It creates 14 problems under one roof, all of them accelerating in the same direction, down. In 2022, Stellantis was the most profitable automaker in the world. In 2025, it posted the biggest loss in Detroit history. That's not a bad year. That's a strategy that was never going to work. The question now isn't whether Stellantis survives. It's which brands make it out alive and which ones become the next Saab or Pontiac or Oldsmobile. Names we remember, cars we don't see anymore. One thing is certain, the Stellantis that exists 5 years from now will look nothing like the 14-brand empire that Carlos Tavares promised would conquer the world. That promise is already worth 22 billion euros less than it was.